April 1945. Somewhere along the Elbe River, in what used to be the heart of the Third Reich, a group of women sit huddled together in the corner of a bombed-out schoolhouse. Their clothes are torn. Their faces are hidden behind scarves, handkerchiefs, even pieces of cloth ripped from their own uniforms. Some press their palms over their eyes. Others turn toward the wall. They do not speak. They barely breathe. Outside, American soldiers stand guard. Inside, the air is thick with fear. These women are prisoners of war, not soldiers in the traditional sense, but members of the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services, radio operators, nurses, clerks. They have been taught that capture means death, or worse, so they hide their faces, as if by covering themselves they might disappear. Hours pass. Then something unexpected happens. One of them laughs, not loudly, just a small sound, almost a gasp. Then another joins, and another. Soon the room fills with the strangest noise, laughter mixed with tears, relief mixed with disbelief. For the first time since the war began, they realize they might survive this. In the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing from every direction. The Red Army pushed from the east, swallowing entire cities in flame and fury. The Americans and British closed in from the west, their tanks rolling through the Rhineland and into the heartland of the Reich. In the south, Allied forces swept up through Italy. In the north, the roads to Berlin became rivers of refugees. The Third Reich, which had once conquered most of Europe, was now a shrinking circle of chaos. And within that chaos were millions of people trying to survive. Among them were thousands of women who had served the German war machine, not as combat soldiers, but as support personnel. They worked as radio operators, telephone switchboard clerks, nurses in field hospitals, administrative assistants in military headquarters. Some served in the Luftwaffe as searchlight operators and aircraft spotters. Others worked in logistics, supply depots, or intelligence offices. These women were called Helferinnen, helpers. They wore uniforms. They followed orders. And under international law, if captured, they could be classified as prisoners of war. But in the final weeks of the war, that legal distinction meant nothing to them. What they feared was far worse than captivity. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled their minds with horrifying stories. They had been told that if the Allies captured them, especially the Soviets, they would be raped, tortured, or executed. Goebbels's radio broadcasts repeated these warnings daily. Newsreels showed images of destruction and claimed the enemy showed no mercy. The women believed it. Why wouldn't they? And so, as the front lines crumbled, many of them ran. Some tried to flee west, toward the Americans or British, hoping they might be treated more humanely. Others were caught in the confusion, trapped between retreating German forces and advancing Allied troops. By April, tens of thousands of German women, military and civilian alike, found themselves in enemy hands. Capture happened in different ways. Some women were found in military hospitals, still wearing their Red Cross armbands, tending to wounded soldiers who could no longer fight. Others were discovered in underground bunkers, sitting at radio sets that had gone silent. A few were caught on the roads, part of retreating columns that had been cut off by advancing tanks. The moment of surrender was always the same. Hands raised, eyes filled with terror. For many, the worst part was not knowing what would happen next. The Geneva Convention of 1929 stated that prisoners of war must be treated humanely. They were entitled to food, shelter, and medical care. They could not be executed or tortured, But these were rules written on paper, and paper meant little in the final days of a war that had already killed tens of millions. The women had heard stories from the Eastern Front. They knew what happened when the Red Army overran German positions. Entire villages had been destroyed. Women had been assaulted. Revenge was brutal and swift. Even in the West, where the Americans and British were generally more disciplined, the women did not feel safe. They had been told that all Allied soldiers were monsters, that they would show no mercy to those who had served the Nazi regime. So when they were captured, many of them covered their faces. Some used scarves. Others tore pieces of fabric from their uniforms. A few pressed their hands over their eyes, as if by not seeing their captors, they might not be seen in return. It was a gesture born of shame, fear, and desperation. They did not want to be recognized. They did not want to be singled out. And above all, they did not want to be remembered as the women who had served Hitler's war machine. But something unexpected happened in those first hours and days of captivity. Instead of violence, there was silence. Instead of cruelty, there was caution. The Allied soldiers who guarded them were often young men, tired from months of combat, unsure of how to handle prisoners who were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Some offered cigarettes. Others brought water. A few even tried to speak a few words of broken German. It was not kindness exactly, but it was not hatred either. And slowly, carefully, the women began to realize that maybe, just maybe, they were not going to die. The women's perspective. To understand why these women covered their faces, you have to understand what they had been taught to believe. From the moment they joined the auxiliary services, they had been told they were part of something greater than themselves. They were serving the fatherland. They were supporting the soldiers who fought for Germany's survival. Their work mattered, but they had also been told something else. They had been told that the enemy was ruthless, that the Soviets were barbarians, that the Americans and British were no better, that if Germany lost the war, there would be no mercy for anyone who had served the Reich. Goebbels' propaganda ministry made sure of that. Radio broadcasts described in graphic detail what would happen to German women if the Allies won. Newsreels showed destroyed cities and claimed that Allied soldiers committed unspeakable acts. Posters warned that surrender meant death. The women believed it because they had no reason not to. Many of them had never traveled outside Germany. They had never met an American or a British person. Their only knowledge of the enemy came from what they were told by their own government. And so, when the moment of capture came, their minds filled with images of the worst possible outcomes. They believed they would be raped. They believed they would be executed. They believed that their faces would be photographed and displayed as trophies, or that they would be paraded through the streets as symbols of defeat. Covering their faces was an act of self-preservation, but it was also an act of shame. Many of these women had grown up in traditional German families where honor and reputation meant everything. To be captured, to be seen as a prisoner, to be associated with a losing cause. It was humiliating. Some of them cried silently. Others stared at the ground, refusing to make eye contact. A few whispered prayers, hoping that somehow they might be spared. But beneath the fear and shame, there was something else. Exhaustion. These women had lived through years of war. They had seen cities burned to ash. They had watched young men die in field hospitals, calling out for their mothers. They had worked 16-hour shifts in freezing bunkers, listening to radio reports of battles lost and territories abandoned. They were tired of the war, tired of the propaganda, tired of pretending that everything would somehow turn out fine. And in that exhaustion, there was a strange kind of clarity. Deep down, some of them had already known the truth. Germany was going to lose, the war was over, and all that remained was survival. So they sat in silence, faces covered, waiting to see what would happen next. The captor's perspective. On the other side of the room stood the Allied soldiers, equally unsure of what to do. Most of them were young men in their 20s. They had fought their way across France, through Belgium, into the heart of Germany. They had seen friends die. They had stormed machine gun nests and cleared out bunkers. They had been trained to fight soldiers, not to handle frightened women hiding their faces in the corner of a bombed-out building. The Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners of war were to be treated with dignity. They were to be given food, water, shelter, and medical attention. Violence against them was strictly prohibited. But following those rules required discipline, especially when emotions ran high. Many of these soldiers had seen the concentration camps. They had walked through the gates of Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. They had seen the piles of bodies. They had met the survivors, walking skeletons who could barely stand. They knew what the Nazi regime had done, and now they were supposed to show mercy to people who had served that same regime. It was not an easy thing to do. Some soldiers felt anger. They wanted revenge. They wanted someone to pay for what they had seen. But most of them were also tired. Tired of killing. Tired of war. Tired of hate. And when they looked at these women, scared, silent, covering their faces, they saw something unexpected. They saw human beings. Not monsters. Not fanatics. Just people who had been caught up in something much larger than themselves. One American soldier later recalled the moment his unit captured a group of German women working at a communications post. He said they were terrified. They thought they were going to be shot. Instead, his commanding officer ordered the men to give them water and find them a place to sit. Another soldier remembered a young German nurse who refused to look at him. She kept her face turned toward the wall, trembling. He placed a canteen of water beside her and walked away. Hours later, she was still holding it, as if afraid to drink. These small moments of restraint were not acts of kindness exactly. They were acts of professionalism. The soldiers had been ordered to follow the rules, and most of them did. But there was something else at play, too. Many of these men had mothers, sisters, girlfriends back home. They knew what it felt like to worry about the safety of the women they loved. And seeing these German women, so clearly terrified, reminded them of that vulnerability. It did not erase the anger. It did not undo the horrors they had witnessed, but it made them pause. Instead of shouting, they spoke quietly. Instead of threats, they offered reassurance. Some said things like, "You're safe now." Others simply gestured toward food or blankets. The women did not believe them at first. How could they? Trust had been shattered by years of propaganda and war. But slowly, over hours and sometimes days, the atmosphere began to shift. The guards stopped being seen as executioners. The women stopped being seen as enemies. And in that fragile space between fear and relief, something human began to emerge. The moment of change did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a sudden revelation. It came quietly, in small gestures that slowly dismantled the walls of fear. In one holding area near the Elbe River, an American medic noticed that several of the German women had untreated wounds, shrapnel cuts, burns from bombings, infections that had gone ignored for days. He approached them carefully, medical kit in hand. The women pulled back, clutching their scarves tighter over their faces. He knelt down a few feet away and opened the kit slowly, showing them bandages, antiseptic, clean cloth. He pointed to one woman's injured arm and then to the supplies. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she extended her arm. He cleaned the wound, wrapped it, spoke a few words in broken German. "Gut, okay, you okay?" She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. But her shoulders relaxed, just slightly. In another camp, a British soldier noticed the women had not eaten in more than a day. They sat in a corner, refusing the rations that had been left for them. They thought the food might be poisoned, or that accepting it would mean something worse would follow. The soldier opened a tin of meat, took a bite himself, then set it down near them. He walked away without saying a word. An hour later, the tin was empty. These were the moments that began to crack the shell of terror. Not grand speeches, not promises of safety. Just small human actions that slowly proved the women were not going to be harmed. And then came the realization. One woman, a former Luftwaffe radio operator named Elsa, later described the moment it hit her. She had been sitting in silence for hours, her face buried in her hands. She had convinced herself that execution was coming, that any moment the door would open and it would be over. But then she noticed something. The guards were talking amongst themselves, laughing, smoking cigarettes. They were not preparing for violence. They were bored. It was such a strange, mundane detail. But it was the detail that changed everything. If they had been planning something terrible, they would not be laughing. They would not be acting so casual. She lifted her head, looked around, and for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to think, "Maybe I will survive this." That realization spread through the group like a silent signal. One by one, the women began to lower their hands, to pull the scarves away from their faces, to look at each other, and then, cautiously, at the soldiers guarding them. And then someone laughed. It was not a joyful laugh, not the kind you hear at a party or among friends. It was something else, entirely, a strange, breathless sound that came from deep exhaustion and sudden relief. One woman, sitting near the window, had been staring at her own hands for what felt like hours. She noticed they were shaking, and then she noticed that the shaking was starting to slow. And for some reason, that struck her as absurd. All this fear, all this certainty of death, and here she was, alive. Watching her own hands stop trembling, she let out a short, choked laugh. The woman next to her turned, confused. Then she saw it too. The absurdity, the relief, the strangeness of being alive when they had been so certain they would not be. She laughed too, and then another, and another. Soon the room was filled with the sound of laughter mixed with crying. Some of the women covered their mouths, as if embarrassed by the noise. Others leaned against each other, shaking with the release of days of pent-up terror. The guards outside, the door stopped talking and looked in, unsure of what was happening. One of them thought there was a problem. But then he saw the women's faces, no longer hidden, no longer frozen in fear, and he understood. They were not laughing because something was funny. They were laughing because they were still alive. It was the kind of laughter that only comes after surviving something you thought would kill you. The kind that mixes relief and disbelief, and the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of being human in the middle of a war. For the first time since their capture, the women allowed themselves to feel something other than fear. They allowed themselves to hope. In the days and weeks that followed, the women were processed as prisoners of war. They were moved to larger holding camps, where they joined thousands of other German military personnel awaiting their fate. The camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and chaotic, but they were not execution sites. They were not torture chambers. They were simply camps. The women were given basic rations, bread, soup, sometimes canned meat. They were assigned sleeping areas, usually in tents or repurposed barracks. Medical staff treated those who were injured or sick. Intelligence officers interviewed them, asking about their roles, their units, their knowledge of military operations. Most of the women had little to offer. They had been clerks, nurses, radio operators. They knew nothing of strategic importance. They had simply done their jobs and tried to survive. The interviews were brief. The paperwork was filed, and then they waited. By the summer of 1945, Germany had officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But for the prisoners, the uncertainty continued. Some were released within weeks, especially those who could prove they were not members of the Nazi Party and had only served in non-combat roles. Others remained in camps for months, waiting for their cases to be reviewed. The conditions varied depending on who was in charge. American and British camps generally followed Geneva Convention standards, though overcrowding and supply shortages made life difficult. French camps were harsher, especially in the early months, as France sought retribution for years of occupation. Soviet camps were the worst. German women captured by the Red Army faced far grimmer conditions. Many were held for years. Some never returned home. But for those held by the Western Allies, there was at least the possibility of eventual release. And slowly, they began to rebuild a sense of normalcy. They formed small communities within the camps, shared stories, sang songs. Some even organized classes, teaching each other languages or skills they hoped might help them in the uncertain future. By the end of 1945, most of the women had been released and sent back to what remained of Germany. But the country they returned to was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The economy had collapsed. Families were scattered or destroyed. And everywhere there was the weight of collective guilt and shame. Germany had lost the war. And now, Germans had to live with what their nation had done. For the women who had served as Helferinnen, reintegration was complicated. Some tried to hide their past. They removed their uniforms, destroyed any records, and pretended they had been civilians all along. Others were open about their service, but faced judgment from neighbors who blamed anyone associated with the military for Germany's destruction. There were no parades for them, no recognition, no acknowledgement of the fear they had endured or the relief they had felt. They simply returned to broken homes and tried to survive. In the years that followed, a few of them gave interviews or wrote memoirs. Their stories revealed a consistent pattern: the same fear of capture, the same propaganda-driven terror, and the same surprise when they realized they would not be harmed. One woman recalled being held in an American camp and receiving a letter from home. Her mother wrote that she had been praying every night, convinced her daughter was dead. When she learned her daughter was alive and being treated fairly, she could not believe it. Another woman described the moment she was released. She walked out of the camp gates, turned back to look at the guards, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the captivity, but for the mercy. These were not stories of heroism. They were not tales of resistance or redemption. They were simply human stories of fear, survival, and the unexpected kindness that can emerge even in the darkest moments of history. The laughter in that bombed-out schoolhouse had been brief, but it marked a turning point. It was the moment when propaganda met reality, when fear gave way to relief, when the women realized that the enemy they had been taught to hate was, in the end, just as human as they were. War teaches people to see the world in simple terms: friend and enemy, us and them, good and evil. But the story of these German women prisoners reveals something more complicated. It shows how propaganda can twist the truth so deeply that people become afraid of their own survival. It shows how fear can make us hide our faces, even when there is no reason to. And it shows how a single moment, a gesture of water, a shared meal, the sound of unexpected laughter, can begin to undo years of lies. These women were not innocent. They had served a regime responsible for unimaginable horrors. But they were also human beings, caught in a war they did not start and could not stop. And when they covered their faces in fear, they were reacting not to reality, but to the version of reality they had been fed. The Allied soldiers who chose restraint over revenge were also acting as human beings. They had every reason to hate. They had seen the camps. They had lost friends. But in that moment, they chose to follow the rules, to offer water instead of cruelty, to let the women sit in silence until they were ready to lower their hands. That laughter, strange, breathless, mixed with tears, was not a celebration. It was a release, a recognition that survival was possible, that the world was not as black and white as they had been told. History often remembers the battles, the generals, the turning points, but it is these small human moments that reveal the true cost of war. Not just in the lives lost, but in the fear created, in the trust destroyed, in the faces hidden behind. Scarves, because people believed they would not be shown mercy, and in the laughter that came when they realized they were wrong. That laughter was not forgiveness. It was not justice, but it was something real. It was the sound of people discovering that even in the worst moments of history, humanity can still break through.